everyone, and welcome back to the Truth and Data podcast, where each episode we tackle a different digital forensics topic. Today, we're really excited to be talking about the intersection of legislation and the digital forensic analysis and overall protection against child sexual abuse material and internet crimes against children, also known as ICAC. And as such, we are delighted to have the most relevant person we could have with us today, and that's Jenny Dutton from Raven. I'm Jessica.
Hi, Jessica. I'm Kim.
And I'm Debbie. We do this every time, Jenny. It literally we talk over each other when we're introducing ourselves.
Okay.
That's what we intro our
days. Clearly this can be edited too. Okay, I forgot.
No, we're no edits. We're no edits. So you are where you are. We just go with it. Because we don't mind being ourselves, because that's who we are.
Okay.
If there's something completely egregious, we'll either re-edit or recall. But we haven't edited a single episode, and you're well in there in terms of numbers we've produced. To scare you now, Jenny. But with that, would you mind telling everyone a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what you're doing now at Raven?
Yeah, certainly. Again, Jenny Dutton. I am from Florida. My background is as a prosecutor in this space primarily. I worked as a state prosecutor I almost made it to the 20-year mark when I got this great opportunity to join Raven. But yeah, and so primarily I did child sex crimes, adult sex crimes for a long time, transitioned into ICAC work as that grew. And then I spent the latter part of my career kind of closing out in the homicide world. Although, I credit a lot of my work in the ICAC space and internet crimes against children for helping me in that world, because there wasn't a homicide either that didn't touch technology and digital forensics. And I certainly had, more knowledge than the average prosecutor going into that unit just because of that work. So that's what I did. And then was looking to get back into the child exploitation space and started exploring some options. And I knew some of the board members of Raven. And when they heard I was ready to leave the state or was thinking about it, reached out to me, because I think Raven at that point was getting, they had been on the Hill a couple of years, and they were really being asked more details about legislation, endorsing legislation. Can you write legislation? And I think they decided collectively that they needed that attorney's perspective. And so I was kind of asked to fill that role, attorney hat, lobbyist hat. I have a lot of hats.
I do love the fact that you're able to bring that prosecutorial experience and bring that with all the fantastic Raven members who are really focused. A lot of them former commanders of Internet Crimes Against Children task forces. That's a hard word to say, task forces. So Jenny, I would really love to know if you could tell us, because not everybody may be familiar with Raven, a little bit about Raven.
Right. So Raven is a 501c4. So we're a nonprofit social justice lobbying organization, which is different than a 501c3. So we are allowed to primarily do lobbying work, so work in the policy legislative space, founded in part by a group of amazing ICAC commanders as they came out of retirement, were entering the private sector and really didn't want to leave their former coworkers behind. And they knew the struggle primarily with funding, and they wanted to see what kind of difference they could make. ICAC commanders and those agencies are barred by their federal grant rules from lobbying. So they really didn't have a voice. They just basically had to take what they were given. Nobody was really speaking on their behalf, and they couldn't. So I think Raven fills a gap that was greatly, that existed for a lot of years. So
you describe it perfectly.
Oh, good.
Debbie, to you, how do you know that she describes it
so
perfectly?
I'm one of the founding board members of Raven, and we did, a lot of us were coming out of retirement and moving into the private sector, but felt this immense responsibility for the people that we left behind in this, what we sort of viewed as an almost unwinnable situation with overwhelming caseloads and lack of resources. And like Jenny said, we felt like we could speak in a way that we could not before. And, we were barred from lobbying, and many of our agencies would not allow us to speak, or say certain things, about the lack of resources or anything like that. So we got together and formed Raven, and we are super happy to have Jenny join us, about a year ago? How long?
Yeah, December 1st,
Yeah.
2024, so almost a year.
Yeah, almost a year. So, and has already written legislation, developed relationships on the Hill, and so we're super happy to have you. But this is about Jenny and Raven, so we're going to turn it back over to her.
I'd love to know, you explained now that the purpose of Raven is as this lobbying legislative thing. And you even brought up that you came in because this is a little bit, outside of the normal realm of what digital forensics practitioners, ICAC commanders do. So it'd probably be really beneficial to get an understanding, how does the legislative process and lobbying fit into this world of internet crimes against children?
Right. Yeah. And it's probably something that most digital forensic examiners and law enforcement officers don't think about, right? Day to day, they don't have time. First of all, it's not in their realm of duties or responsibilities, but it plays a huge role in two ways, I think. First, because all funding, right, starts at the policy legislative level, whether that's your reoccurring funding, your grants, your one-time opportunities with congressional directed funding, or at your state level. And then obviously substantive laws, like are our laws there to support law enforcement and prosecutors once we, quote, get the bad guy. So, and that's on the criminal side. And then there's also the civil side. There's a lot of civil laws in this space, holding tech accountable, trying to make avenues for victims to be able to pursue justice on a civil side against different types of companies. So there's a lot that goes into this.
Wow, that's really cool, because it's not just the funding angle. It's also making sure that the legislation is correct. And I can tell you, as a forensics examiner, I am so happy to know that there's someone there advocating for how the technology actually works, because sometimes there's disparity between what the knowledge base is of the people making the laws and how the technology actually works, that sometimes causes frustration. And I know that I've been really excited because I've seen a lot of legislation now that's actually taking into account real technology developments. I know that I've seen things that have come out around, how do we charge AI generated content, regardless of if both avenues, if it's completely AI generated CSAM, or if it's AI generated, but it actually is based on someone else. So taking a real minor's face and then putting it into acts that minor didn't commit. Can you tell us anything about laws that might be in that realm? That's very fascinating.
Absolutely. Obviously, there are a lot of states that had already started making movement on this. When I actually contracted with Raven for about a year before I came on board full time, when I was still at the state, and that was the sort of my marching orders at that time. There were, with AI and Gen AI, there were a lot of opinions, a lot of politicians wanting to do something, but obviously you want them to be educated, right, and making the right decisions. There were myths out there that this actually, Gen AI, CSAM wasn't illegal. We have to make it illegal. Well, it is, and it has been for some time, conceptually under our federal obscenity laws, right? The problem, so when we all kind of took a step back and I tried to get all the different offices and staffers to take a look at what do we have and then where are the loopholes, because for the states that haven't made the move too, they're going to look to the federal, a lot of them look to the federal government, what are they doing? So this year, finally, as a culmination of all of these conversations, I authored and is introduced in both chambers as of now. It's called the Enforce Act. What the Enforce Act does is, when you look at our current obscenity laws, which have been on the books, haven't had to be used at the scale to which DOJ is now going to have to use them, right? When a offender creates CSAM, purely with
just for clarification for folks who don't know, CSAM is child sexual abuse material.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting, Jenny. The
No, you're
acronym is
fine.
always the thing.
Yeah, formally referred to as child pornography. And you create that without a known or identifiable child. You just create it out of with artificial intelligence. It was prosecutable under federal obscenity laws, and kind of ironically carried at the time, still right now carries the same prison sentence, right, as a regular CCM offender or a another sex offense under the federal laws. Where the prosecutors, as these cases, there's many in the pipeline now, are seeing the problem. The big one, I think, is currently, if you're convicted of this, you would not be a registered sex offender in the US. So that's one thing. So it was mostly we're calling them like the collateral consequences of you offending. So the possible prison sentence is the same, 5 to 20 years, but there was a statute of limitations on the crime that doesn't exist on CSAM and other sex crimes. CSAM offenders at the federal level and other sex offenders get what's called a presumption of detention. So when prosecutors walk in a courtroom, it's presumed that the court's going to detain them, and the defense has to overcome that, right? The burden's on the defense to prove why you should let this person out pending trial. That is not with the obscenity laws. So it's almost, it's the opposite. So it's an uphill battle for prosecutors instead of defense. On CSAM offenders, there's a required term of supervised release after any prison sentence. I mean, if these are the type of offenders that aren't going to get a very long sentence, right? You want that supervision on the back end, potentially for treatment and obviously to keep an eye on them. That's not a requirement under obscenity. And then obviously the big one is sex offender registry. So we looked at it and we're like, all right, it is illegal. It's going to be used now at scale. It needs to be equal, we believe, to anyone that is to, offend in this way, right? So you're basically equating it to current CSAM standards.
And so sorry.
No, and it does one more thing. It also, which is an important thing, it currently, under the federal law, if you do use an identifiable child and you modify that with CSAM, like what you're talking about, there is an element prosecutors would have to prove that that person had an intent to distribute it. So basically, if they can't show that that person intended to distribute it, that they just created this and they kept it for themselves, which is not good, they wouldn't be able to meet their burden. So we basically, the Enforce Act would just remove that element. So we don't have to prove that you intended to distribute this. It's sufficient that you created it and you possess it and all those things. So, and then it changes the min-man for that crime. So it's a really good law that will bring everything, I think, where it needs to be as far as punishment and accountability.
I know when I was, still working sworn law enforcement, still working in the ICAC space as a law enforcement officer, I would much rather have them have to register as a sex offender and get not that we want this either, but I would rather have a slightly lower sentence and have them have to register as a sex offender because then they are trapped. And that's what these offenders need, in my opinion. So I think that's one of the most important aspects of that legislation.
And even more important, the right of the public to be able to look and figure out who's in their area, learn their faces for parents, and so that they can protect their children. I'm sure that I hope that most people who listen to this know that they can go on the sex offender registry, look up people in their area, or even if they're moving to another area, that address or where their mother-in-law lives or when they're visiting, and actually look up who the sex offenders are in that area, get a sense of what the crime and charge was, and be able to look at their faces and their addresses, which is completely a preventative measure for, maybe we don't want to be at the park when that person's there. I would say I am a little bit taken aback at the fact that there would even be a concept that taking a real child's face and manipulating it to put it into child sexual abuse material would not be a crime if just because you weren't distributing it. That's still harm at that child. That's still someone taking an inappropriate liberty with that child's likeness. And so I'm really glad to hear that you've drafted this. Can you give us a little status on where this one is?
Yeah, the Enforced Act was led on the House side initially, and it was introduced this summer. And then we got Senate sponsors, and they were headed towards introducing it. And then, of course, there was an August recess and then a shutdown, but it has been introduced in October. So introduced to both chambers, looking for probably a Senate markup is probably going to be the next stage. So
can you just super briefly talk about the bipartisan support that Raven gets on these particular pieces of legislation in general?
Yeah, absolutely. It is very important to have, obviously, bipartisan support. And we are lucky in both the House and Senate judiciary committees. There's a number of, we'll call them champions. And a lot of times they all work together. I think people would be probably surprised due to just the current landscape. Oh no, some of these people actually do work together on issues that are important. So yeah, we have both Republicans and Democrats as lead sponsors, they call it, and it's been introduced in both chambers.
So when you were talking about this is helping, to shape our laws, thank goodness that there are folks like you out there that are trying to do this for us, on this federal level. So you're also looking at some other things in terms of funding, right? Yeah. So how does that dovetail within, because a lot of us who came from the ICAC world, we were used to, our ICAC grants and things along those lines. So how does this dovetail with that?
Right. So the PROTECT Act, the Protect Our Children Act, was initially passed in 2008, the current version of that. It has to come up for reauthorization every couple of years. It's 2 to 4 years, depending on what is put in the law. And so Raven has been working on the PROTECT Act. It's currently in that stage where it needs to be reauthorized. And so through that act, it does a lot of things. It sets out ICAC purposes, duties, and things like that. But most importantly, it is the basis for their funding. And so you want to keep that grant program active and authorized. And then kind of dovetailing with that is the appropriations process that goes along with that, constantly trying to increase the missing and exploited children's budget, which maybe ICAC commanders may not know that's where they actually come under, but it's under DOJ, Office of OJJDP, and the missing and exploited children's budget. So we share that budget with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, programs like Amber Alert, and then the ICACs, and all their funding and training programs come out of there. So yes, legislation has to exist for that program to exist, and then you work on the appropriations with those committees behind the scenes.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't realize how closely you all worked to ensure that what folks already feel as though they have is going to continue and going to hopefully grow.
Yes. Yeah, it is. And again, in the past, there hasn't really been, luckily there are there's champion members that have been on this bill since 2008. And by member, I mean the elected members that keep it going. But really, there hasn't been a nonprofit group or a lobbying organization, like I said, really having their back on that in DC. I find it interesting. I sit on a coalition of people and orgs in this space. And when you take a look at it, I mean, it's a great coalition. It's made up of, name all the orgs you could think of, and more that I'd never heard of, right? And so many of them are survivor victim-based orgs, right? And that's obviously very important, but Raven is the only organization, probably 30 plus, that kind of speaks to that smaller sliver of the solution, which is law enforcement.
Yeah.
The law enforcement voice, right?
The law enforcement voice, yes.
So. And in some ways, in a lot of ways, the victim's voices too.
Yeah, right. And that's the thing, is like when I talk to people, it's we all have the same goal, and we just each represent like a little piece of the pie almost. But it's
I'll elaborate. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'll elaborate on that just a tiny bit. like Jenny said, there are a lot of organizations in this space doing great work, but sort of all have a little bit different focus.
Mhm.
There was no organization educating lawmakers about the challenges that law enforcement faces once law enforcement gets these cases. So, they knew about cyber tips, and they knew about how the volume of the increase in cyber tips. They knew, they knew a lot, but they had no idea of, once it gets to law enforcement, what happens and what are the challenges. So we were the only organization that is educating lawmakers related to the law enforcement function.
Yeah. And it is hard, and it's not their fault. They just didn't understand how the workflow went. And, a lot of people assumed it was all federal work. Oh, the FBI, we've gotten that. The FBI does all of this. No, and then HSI does all of it. Or, we've even been told, well, doesn't the National Center have law enforcement officers like NCMEC?
They thought NCMEC investigated the cyber tips.
Yeah. And so it's a lack of knowledge. And we're like, no, and especially when you're speaking to a House member who has a very specific district, it's like, oh no, by the way, this police department in your district is actually commanding this for your entire state, and its state and locals have this percentage, and then the feds obviously have a role. So they're like, oh, it's just a lack of knowledge. There was nobody there explaining it to anybody. So,
but they probably felt as though something was being done, so they may have felt like, okay, well, we've checked the box here.
Yeah,
something is being done, so then we don't need to worry about it. This educational part is huge.
How it's being done. And then when you show those statistics from pre-COVID, I mean, obviously from early on, but you can even just go back to 2018, 2019, and then show the cyber tip statistics to now. I mean, it's astronomically different. And they're functioning with no more money, no more human beings, no more technology than they had 6 years ago. So
in Georgia, our cyber tips double about every 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And the funding doesn't necessarily increase at that rate.
Yeah.
So Jenny, Kim sort of asked you about funding, and we've talked about the PROTECT Act and sort of the ICAC grants in general. There's other ways that Raven is trying to obtain funding for the task forces. Can you sort of talk about some of those strategies?
Yeah. So there's process in DC, and it used to be referred to as earmarks, right? There's a federal earmark process. It went away in the US for a number of years, and then it was brought back a couple fiscal cycles ago, and it's now referred to as congressional directed spending or project funding. And so what we took a look at, Raven did, it was like, the ICACs ever really gone after this? And is there a pot of money that would apply to them? And there's a specific, section of the funding under the COPS grant that would go to increase scope and scale of their technology, which is,
I'm sorry, what's the COPS grant?
So under DOJ, there's obviously a number of traditional grants. There's COPS, and I'm not sure.
I should know.
These are commonly known in law enforcement. There's Burn JAG. Burn JAG tends to deal with training, but COPS does a lot with technology, and not just like the technology we want, but like say an agency wants to increase body cams or anything that is with tech they can put in. So these COPS grants and exist in a traditional sense of they could apply through a traditional grant process. There's also kind of a secondary way where a member office, and it's like a much shorter application than a traditional grant process would be. And it's a different way to access this money. So what Raven did last year is we put it out to the 61 commanders of who would be interested in potentially us helping, because the other thing we value add is we can then go lobby for your application, right? Whereas they couldn't do those extra things to hopefully get attention to it. And so in the end, I worked with dozens of task forces, and we ultimately were member granted. We are not in the end of this process, but currently right now, 19 different ICACs are looking at obtaining $12 million.
That's great.
That will all be towards technology, hardware, software, training towards those ends, mobile forensic vans. And so that's a specific pot of money that wasn't really tapped before. And again, it's one-off money. So you want it to be that, like, can we scale up? Can we add? What's our dream list, right?
Right. It's not recurring.
Right.
It's
not recurring.
unless they apply every year and are granted the funding.
And so
by the way, COPS is community-oriented policing services.
Yeah.
I should have known that, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's okay. But yeah, there's so a lot of tech is eligible under that particular section. So yeah, so the process is through the member offices. So they look, and then they can pick so many projects that they want to support, whether it's a senator and it just has to be in their state, or a member in their district. So we target those. We look at the ICAC, what's your address? Obviously, you've got your 2 state senators, and then you've got potentially 1 representative. So you have like 3 chances, potentially. Not all elected members participate in this process, but a majority do. So, some of them had 3 shots, some of them just had 1 shot to put in. And so we were pretty successful overall in obtaining those. Now, those are now sitting along with all federal earmarks in an appropriations bill, waiting for Congress to either pass a budget or, attach it to a CR. So I feel like we've done everything, we could. And now this is a bigger fight, right, with what's going on with our federal government.
And then you'll start all over again.
Yes. So that's one way. The other way, which I think is going to be really the way we put a lot of effort into going forward, is through state funding. We saw some success this past year in both New Jersey and Florida with going after state money. And so we kind of looked at the whole U.S. landscape, how many states are already supporting their ICACs and how many are not, and then kind of picked out some critical states that we need to target. So again, I found through Florida, I did that project last year, and it's honestly a lack of education, and I don't want to say it's easier at the state level, but I mean, states are obviously easier to manage. It's less members. It's, it's not as cumbersome as the federal process. So I'm really looking forward to adding on this year. We're going to try to go into Wyoming, and we're talking to some other states about getting them. And that would be, the goal there would be state reoccurring money.
That's even better.
Yeah, no, it's even better. And that's the thing, is because we will fight, and we will continue to fight in DC for that missing and exploited budget. Like I said, the ICAC grants to go up. But if you think about that number, what it will take for that number to significantly go up, then it gets passed through 61, it gets divided. I mean, so like even when we make strides, it's still getting divided amongst the task forces appropriately. So state money will have a huge impact. Florida has funded now their state ICACs for the first time ever at a rate of $3 million annually. $3 million.
That's a lot.
And it's
especially compared to zero.
That's life changing for those task forces.
Yeah, I can tell you, Central and South federal grant money, just put in perspective for you, was about $560,000 last year. North's was about $510,000. So that's all they got to run. South Florida and Central Florida ICAC, their numbers are greater than most states, to put it in perspective. As far as
and it totally makes sense, right? I've spoken to folks in the Orlando metro area, and they have an outsized percentage because literally Disney World, and the fact that is an attractive place to lure children. It totally makes sense.
Yeah.
As sad as it is.
Yeah.
So Jenny, how when you are trying to help these states, let's say like some states that may not have much money within their budget let's set aside this $3 million. Let's give this to this what's a wonderful cause.
Right.
Some states just don't have it. So what are some creative ways maybe that you're able to get or to work with some states in order to be able to generate or to, funnel some funds toward ICAC?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to, every state's going to be different, right? And so, we obviously, the goal we would want just reoccurring money, general fund type stuff. I know other states have had to get creative, and some states are tying it to either device downloads, or some states have tacked on a fee. Like, when a defendant enters a plea, like on a DUI here in Florida, like there's so many fines and things they get hit with, and part of that money may go to MAD or something, and then like domestic violence, some of their money goes back to the domestic violence shelters. So there's a concept too of tying a fee maybe to CSAM and sexual offenders that may go back to the ICAC. So that's all being tried in various states. The problem with that obviously is that means those numbers are not always going to be consistent, and we've got to see what does that actually generate. So it's not the preferred way to do it, but there's certainly ways that if a state comes back and was like, look, we just don't have the money, or we can commit 1 million, but we will also tie it to maybe a fee-based thing. Those are all possibilities, but yeah, we would explore every option depending on the landscape there and the financial need.
Jenny, this is fabulous. Really important to think about the funding. But I'd also look at love for you to talk to us a little bit about some of Raven's successes they've had. I know that this past year I saw that Raven was at the Take It Down Act signing. Could you share a little bit about what the Take It Down Act is and Raven's role in that legislation that got passed?
Yeah, that was pretty awesome. I know long before I came on board, obviously that was a big push in the prior Congress. Luckily, it bled over into this Congress and was passed early this year. And so Raven and its members that have been on the Hill for a while got a chance to attend that by invite, because we had been pushing that as obviously a great piece of legislation.
What is it?
Yeah, right. When you talk about what it is and what it will do, specifically in the area of child exploitation, it covers both adults and children in this realm. But kind of another misnomer out there is people may think, especially if you don't do this work, like a parent per se, there's a lot of assumption out there that like just a naked picture of a child is CSAM or child pornography. Just, and I think you may know from working in this space, that's not exactly legally true, right? The legal definition of child pornography, or as we refer to now as CSAM, is very specific, right? And so there are images of children that don't meet that legal definition, but yet are harmful, right? And so what Take It Down did is it criminalized the publication of what they are now calling an intimate image, an intimate visual depiction of a child or an adult, an identifiable one, from somebody who has the intent of distributing that to, harass them, humiliate them, and things like that. So it's going to cover all of those images that would have been, less than, would not have met the legal definition of CSAM when we're talking about the child, and criminalize that behavior if it's done, obviously, with the intent to harass or abuse that child. So it's a huge piece of legislation, both for, children in that realm, and then adults too. Like a lot of people may, the individual states had like revenge porn laws, right? So this is sort of the federal equivalent of that for adults, that if you do this to an adult and they're identifiable in that image, you now have a federal option. And then within the bill, sort of outside of this, there's a mechanism now to which you can get assistance in taking these down from the platforms. And then the FTC, I believe, is the governing body over enforcing that. So you make the proper notifications to take this material down, and now there's a set of rules and guidelines for those companies, and then enforcement by the FTC, which wasn't there previously.
I love that, because there's enforcement on two ends. There's the criminalization of the existence of this imagery when used in this negative intent. But then there's also the beauty of the fact that now there's a process by which victims or their parents can request the removal of this imagery. What about the Safe Cloud Storage Act? What's up with that one?
Yeah, that is a new bill that also I worked on this summer. There's been, and your digital forensic audience will be very familiar with this. So there's been a lot of talk in the law enforcement space for a while about why aren't we storing, sharing, and processing our CSAM in the cloud?
Mhm.
Obviously, there may be some law enforcement out there doing it, but the large legal opinions across the country given to agencies is, if you were to do this and technically obviously be supported by a third-party private vendor, right? Pick your cloud service. Transmitting that to them technically is illegal under the law. They are not a law enforcement agency. You're not supposed to do that. So it's just, again, it's one of those loopholes, and this law will bring us into a modern world where we can do this. And so what it does, it essentially allows law enforcement to contract with third-party private vendors for this service. And then once they've engaged in that relationship with the vendor, then it sets out cybersecurity requirements. Obviously, we want it to be the most secure environment for the sensitive type of data. And a lot of time people get nervous or they get real taken aback when you propose the concept, but I have to follow that up with, do you realize though that every single other piece of information law enforcement is keeping, all personal information in this country, criminal history records, military, top secret, classified, it's all being kept in the cloud. Like, this is literally the only thing not being kept there. And so the permission to do it, and then obviously that triggers, you've got to follow these rules, third-party vendor, and then there's some reporting requirements to make sure DOJ knows who's doing this, and then the state AG's offices if they're state contracts. And so we are very excited. It was just introduced in the Senate in October. We just secured our House sponsor last week, and so working on introduction there. So it's our latest bill, but it needs to be done. And there's so much talk about it. And finally, Raven just came to me and was like, okay, everyone's talking. Can you just write something, please?
No, this is great, because this is one of those places where, as practitioners, we understand A, our need for being able to store and process in the cloud, and B, we understand the difference between private and public cloud. We're aware of GovCloud and how that is used in government. And because of that awareness, it seems almost silly to us that we're able to utilize this technological resource that exists for every other piece of data imaginable, but because of the content, you can't use this, even though it's a private cloud, even though it could be set apart to only be used.
Right.
To be honest, it can be restricted even more so than people are aware. It doesn't mean that whoever your cloud provider is can access the data. And
right, correct.
A technological awareness challenge to be able to get that change. So it's so exciting to see Raven picking up this variety of legislature, because we see it impacting funding. We see it impacting how we process and deal with the content, how we can get training, how we can get the ability to criminalize things that previously weren't criminal. So there's just so many different aspects that are being tackled, that this is great. What would be your view for the future of what you hope Raven can accomplish? Maybe, this doesn't have to be obviously for 2025, got like a month left, but what do you love to see Raven accomplish?
Well, obviously I would love, our priorities are the PROTECT Act, the overall funding, right? The base funding for ICAC. So that needs to happen. And we're very, very close. We're as close as they've been in a while. The Safe Cloud Storage Act will be a priority. Enforce will be a priority for us next year. Now I've been told, I think take it down. I think I was told 14, 15 months from introduction to passage was like,
wow,
fast. That's fast apparently in DC. So, I would love to see us close those 3 bills out this year. Obviously we support other things. There's a very comprehensive piece of legislation called the Stop CSAM Act that does a lot of things for victims at the federal level. So we're pushing that. And then, just, you guys know, technology moves certainly faster than legislation and the policy wheels in DC, but trying to just stay on top of that. You've got AI chatbots, you've got, AI companions, all of that's coming down, and the bigger, broader issues with social media platforms and civil liability. So there's a lot to tackle.
So our examiners who are listening, people who are currently working in ICAC task forces, what would be your suggestion to what they can do to participate or help with this process or be more aware? Is there anything that our listeners, particularly those who are already working in the ICAC realm, could be doing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously staying just in the know, and I know they've got so much stuff going on, but I do think it's important to know where when obviously they feel strained and they feel like nobody's listening, and why don't I have a better computer and, training and all that. Just being in the know obviously is first to start, and following us and following other organizations in the space. And then if you are in an agency where you are allowed to speak, because some are allowed to speak at a state level, right? And you see and you've identified an issue in your state, I mean, reach out to us. We have that network of commanders, but obviously there's agencies and affiliates and thousands of them working in this space as well. So if you have a specific need in your agency, if it's ICAC related, we may be able to help you even at the state level. We're small, but we're mighty. I just want to help everyone. Like Q1 of this year, where I spent most of my time working with the commanders on those federal grants, was the most fun, because I get to, everybody's task force works differently and everybody has different challenges. And I just have a heart for the men and women that do this work. So I just want to be able to help you if I can.
And if people want to find that information and keep up with it, I cannot advocate enough for the newly designed Raven website. It's brand new, it's better. And I know just at the end of October, there's articles both about the Enforce Act being introduced, about the Safe Cloud Storage Act being introduced. So that's just a really great place for people to go to stay informed of what's happening in that legislation. So me advocating a little bit for people to go sign up, follow you all on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and we're very active.
You're very active there on LinkedIn and on the blog. So if you have an RSS feed, throw it in your RSS feed. I don't even know if anyone does that anymore. That might have been me being a really old nerd, but so that you can follow on that blog. But if you just follow on LinkedIn, you'll see all the blogs get shared. I know that's where I regularly keep up with the news from Raven.
I'll throw out one more resource where people can follow legislation is on congress.gov.
Oh, absolutely.
I have alerts set for all of the legislation that Raven is participating in or following or supporting. And you can go there and you can actually find the verbiage of the bill, the text of the introduced bills. You can find out where it is in the process and all the end. You can get alerts if you set alerts. So congress.gov is another great place to go if you're interested in following legislation.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to put all those links.
Yeah, and for the law enforcement members listening, to look forward in this year for an additional page on our website for law enforcement resources, more specific information like that, where they can go directly to, like after Take It Down, I put out a guide for law enforcement specifically for ICAC commanders and sent it out and asked them to then forward on to their affiliates. Things like that we want to place on the website so anybody can just go there. Probably will be like a password protected part of the website, but for law enforcement, they're used to those sorts of resources, but we want to be a resource for them as well.
That's so awesome. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for joining us and talking about this important topic and everything that's being done. I'm going to say one more thing that I'm sure you wouldn't say, which is for anyone who's listening to this, another thing you can do is it is a nonprofit. It is a lobbying nonprofit, but it does mean that you can make a donation. And for those of you who are thinking of year-end gifts, this is me personally speaking, not from anywhere else, but just be aware that that is an organization that you can donate to. So Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.